Yeah, I just started by thinking about like what trying to reflect on what I'm really thinking about this Earth Day, which I'm sure for a lot of you as well is really hard when you're super busy with lots of other things to distract you, which can feel kind of nice too. But I was kind of thinking about what's my experience been recently because, like all of you, I've been through a huge transition, right, of moving from MUWCI like across the world for me back to California and kind of settling into a really new environment. So some of the things that stood out to me, if you can go to the next slide, Anmo. Okay. This is like where like I was staying in my 2-week quarantine with Maria. So basically, this is the town of Bolinas, and this is like what I was greeted with. Right, Bolinas closed to visitors for duration of pandemic. Um, you know, stay safe, shelter in place. There were actually people protesting. This is a beach town, and so um, the beach town gets a lot of like traffic on holidays and weekends because people from the San Francisco, like greater Bay Area, especially the city, come out to this beach town to kind of, go surfing or relax on the beach or go for hiking. There's a lot of hiking trails. Um, and they were saying, like you need to stay away because we're a community here. We have an older population, right? And we need to keep those people safe. So you need to stay in your houses. And it just kind of got me thinking about um, like the inequality, right, in the response to COVID. And, it's nothing new, right? That inequality already exists, but the ways in which it's kind of perpetuated are made really, really clear through the kind of measures that need to be taken, right? Like people who are stuck in their homes, who are subject to domestic violence, right? Or people who are stuck in their homes and urban neighborhoods and aren't able to recreate in parks. Those kind of things is what I was really thinking about. And so those are the things that I'm really reflecting about today on today's Earth Day, right? Thinking about, or yesterday's Earth Day, really, but thinking about the kind of like inequality that we have in our societies and the way that affects people's access to things like public space to recreate, like healthy food, right? Like in so many ways is intertwined with the kind of like environmental politics that we practice, right? And there are many different kind of environmental politics that we can practice as environmentalists, right? Some that are more inclusive, right? And many environmental politics which are really divisive, right? And create exclusive spaces for some. Um, so next slide. Anyways, sorry, I wanted to like share some nice visuals. So, but also I was really lucky to be able to stay, right, like in this town of this beachside town in Bolinas. And so my time has also been filled with a lot of like reflections in nature. I've been spending a lot of time in nature, especially in these 2 weeks, going to visit the tide pools. That's where we saw this starfish. And I mean, just seeing like the beauty of our earth, that's also been part of my reflections of like how beautiful this place is, how grateful I am to share this planet with so many other wonderful species and other beings. And you guys are some of them, but there are other ones like the starfish, like my cat Shuki, who's stuck in MUWCI right now. I just love all these beings, and I don't really want to live in a world without them. And that I really do believe in fighting for that, as an environmentalist. But how to kind of pair that with your love of people and commitment to equity and equality, when sometimes in environmentalism those two goals are really put at odds. And that's kind of what I want to focus on today, is like what kind of different environmentalisms are there, what does this crisis kind of reveal about them, and how might we be able to pursue a more like equitable environmental politics, because oftentimes these things are at odds. The idea of saving the earth, or saving biodiversity, and being equitable and having some kind of commitment to justice, and that we should preserve human rights. And to me, that seems like a huge like loss and an irony that we really have to overcome in environmentalism. to move forward in a positive way. So, and I've spent a lot of my time, thinking about this before COVID, but I'm going to try to kind of situate it in this context. So, have you guys seen the news? There are dolphins in Venice. So I think this has been at this point debunked properly. That sorry, it's fake news, you guys. But that doesn't. I mean, just because that's fake news, it doesn't mean that things haven't changed in Venice, right? I mean, citizens there do report that the waters have kind of like cleared up, and that maybe they're able to see fish better in the canals and stuff. That may be true, right? Like those reports are coming out as well. And we've also seen like across the world that like air pollution levels have dropped. And I'll be talking about citizen science, like I guess later today or tomorrow. But I mean, people are encouraged, right, to like report your, air pollution where you are by taking pictures of the horizons, and you can participate in that. But there are real like changes we can see in the environment right now as a result of some of the measures that have been taken to address COVID, right? But some of this has been really exaggerated, like the one I'm sharing in this presentation. And there is also like other news that I think really relates to kind of how we respond to the environmental crisis that we're in of climate change. But we don't really see being like thrown into that conversation. So like the conversation around the environment focuses on the ways that these environments have been cleaned up by these measures, but we're not really putting the spotlight on like news about like migrants being kind of like rounded up, or the people who are being like held in home and environments where they face domestic abuse. Like that's also, a result of the kind of measures we've taken as a response to this crisis, right? And I would argue that just as kind of people's, struggles for better like wages or healthcare is like intimately linked to the kind of action that we take on climate change, which my students will be really familiar with this argument. It may be like new to other people, but I would say we can say the same thing in the face of this COVID crisis, right? That our response to the environment, was not actually a policy decision to like clean up the canals in Venice or clean up the air, right? Like that's not why that's happening. But there are other kind of more intentional decisions we've taken about how we treat people or who gets access to medical care, right? Which have been policy decisions, which I would argue we should be really concerned about in the face of, our commitment to hopefully equity, right? Anyways, we can go to the next slide. All right, so the big question that I'll just get to the point is kind of are we the virus, right? If we are saying, oh, if people, stay home and all that stuff, right? Like the environment just gets cleaned up. There's this looming question, like, are we the virus? And people reflecting, and you see it in the media, it's all over Twitter, these kind of claims that like we are the virus, and that in some way there's like this silver lining to what's happening with COVID and the response to COVID, that basically it's it's kind of putting us in our place, and there will be like this tremendous, loss of life, but almost that's like kind of like collateral damage or something, which I, would argue is a really like criminal kind of perspective. I think that this is kind of reviving an argument that, has existed for a long time. Like I will get into some definitions in a second, but basically like an eco-fascist argument that kind of echoes things like the population bomb or Garrett Hardin's A Tragedy of the Commons, which I'm going to speak about. And I think we really need to reject this kind of rhetoric. Like our solutions are not going to be found in blaming like humanity, or especially like the poor or people of color or immigrants or refugees, right, for our problems. Like our solutions are going to be found in really like working together, really listening to people who are marginalized, and rallying around the kind of things that they need, right? Because those are things that we need as a society, right? If we really want to make environmental change, right? Lasting, sustainable change. That means having sustainable, human systems as well, social systems. That's why we have an interdisciplinary class around environmental systems and societies, I would argue, because those things are linked, right? You can't isolate the kind of action we're taking on the environment from the kind of action that we're taking on living wages or healthcare for all or things like that. Like they're intertwined. And so by going over a few things like what ecofascism is and what is Garrett Hardin's argument about the tragedy of the commons, I'm going to hope to kind of show you, if I can, how this argument is really dangerous, that we are the virus, and hopefully point us in a different direction in terms of our environmental politics that kind of says we need to really stand with working class people and with marginalized like identity groups and people in general. So can we go to the next slide? Okay, so I just want to share this quote that I think kind of sums up part of like my feelings around this. So Jacqueline Klopp, who's co-director of the Earth Institute's Center for Sustainable Urban Development at Columbia University, said like we should, well, kind of what I've been trying to echo right now, that we should not be celebrating these efforts on the environment because they're not efforts on the environment, right? It's a result of policies that are actually hurting a lot of people in a way, but with a goal of saving some people in mind. And that's a whole nother conversation, right? On the valuation of different lives, right? And who really matters right now. And there are a lot of people who are rising up and making that argument that we should be reopening the economy, things like that. And I think we need to take them seriously. Like we can't just disengage with working class people who are standing up and asking to reopen the economy so that they can get back to work. They have real valid concerns. But I do agree with Jacqueline Klopp, right, that this should serve as a warning. She says it's not constructive to treat the pandemic as a policy response in terms of thinking it's helping us with our structural problems around emissions. It's a symptom of us not addressing our serious environmental and social problems, right? And this echoes, if you're familiar with Naomi Klein, right, thinking about disaster capitalism, right, and the way that our system takes advantage of crises, right, to kind of, and both sides try, right? And whenever there's a crisis, though, it's an opportunity in a way, and some people see it as an opportunity to make certain kinds of political change. And the reason is that those crises really highlight, right, the shortcomings of our current system. And I think we're seeing that right now, right? Like for me, it's really highlighted the kind of like inequality in the community that I grew up in, and seeing how kind of segregated people are and stuff when they're not able to come to common spaces, right, to meet one another. Okay, so we can go to the next slide, I think. This slide was a little redundant, I realize that now. Okay, so ecofascism is kind of like a key theme, I guess, in my talk. But it's basically a strain of ecological thinking. It's a way and a type of environmentalism, I would say, or an environmental ideology, but it's also just an ideology that has like roots in neo-Nazism, basically, that treats humans as this kind of cancer, or we could say now, right, virus, okay, on the earth, right? And it's that like a lot of the earth's problems, or the problems we have in the world, are just a result of humans being here, okay? And the eco-fascist response to this is to kind of control how that plays out so that poor people or people of color, like marginalized identities, are the ones who suffer the greatest consequence, right? And in some cases, I mean, this is a very dangerous ideology. In some cases, like with the population bomb, it's that people need to be taken out. And this is it's very connected to eugenics as well, right? That we have to go to poor countries, less economically developed countries, and perform like sterilization campaigns. And I mean, it's been the backbone of a lot of really dangerous policies that have actually been enacted, like, and taken forward, right? And this thinking isn't just prevalent in one group, okay? It's not like there's a group of eco-fascists online who are like hanging out and talking to each other. That does exist, but I would argue that this ideology kind of pervades a lot of like our mainstream thinking around environmental crisis. And that's when we start to confuse certain facts about like carrying capacity with certain kind of judgments or policy decisions on what should be done in the face of that. So to say that, you know, the Earth has a carrying capacity is just a fact, right? Yeah, the Earth has a carrying capacity, but to say because of that, we need to cut down our population, and for that reason, people who are poor or people who have more babies should be the first to go, is a really different kind of position to take. But it is something that has seemed rather slippery, right? And we've seen, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but a lot of people who've committed kind of acts of terrorism cite kind of environmental justifications for their actions, and blame marginalized people for the environmental problems that we're facing. There's a lot of scapegoating, kind of, you know, very similar to neo-Nazism, where this ideology comes from. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Okay, so what's the tragedy of the commons? Because I mentioned this earlier, and I think this is a good kind of, I don't know, point that's familiar to so many people, right? Like everybody, I mean, many of you probably have already read The Tragedy of the Commons or are familiar with it. In my class, ESS, like, of course, you've read it, but if you end up going to college, by the end of college, I mean, it'd be, I'd be surprised if you didn't read this at some point. It's so commonly assigned as a text, and yet Garrett Hardin was a eugenicist and nativist, and I mean, it's basically an ideology that says property, you know, that's held in common, the commons, is prone to overuse. It'll be over allocated, over exploited, right? And privatization is a solution. It creates an owner who has an incentive to kind of use responsibly and use within their the capacity, right? So it's that private use is sustainable use, essentially. But he also had texts about like lifeboat ethics, right? Which was using a metaphor for that we live in an earth with finite resources, which is related to his argument for the tragedy of the commons in a way, and that you know, only some of us are going to be able to really survive, and that we should be careful to structure kind of who can survive in a really inequitable way, right? And he argues really for saving primarily like white settlers, essentially. So I hope that these ideas are like useful in just kind of framing the kind of environmentalism that I'm trying to talk about. That's, we're seeing a response from that kind of ideological point of view to COVID, which I find, you know, really concerning. It's not new though. I would say this more as a revival or a strengthening of this ideology of eco-fascism. And I would say though that it's not so different from other kind of environmentalisms that see themselves differently, and that's why it's a slippery slope. If we think about nature, I mean, does one of my ESS students want to tell us what nature is? Do you remember when we talked about nature? Deepakshi, do you want to go for it?
Oh my God. Okay. So when we talked about nature in first term, we said that there's so much difference in what's pure or what's pristine, and is nature just like the environment around us, or does it also include like us and our interactions with it? So like there were various understandings of nature, and not just, okay, plants and animals and that's the end of it.
Right. No, okay, so some really great themes that come up. Thank you so much, Deepakshi. This idea that nature is separate from humans, is this like pristine place that we can go to, right? But we can never be in nature, is a kind of, I mean, there are many different ways to see nature around the world, I'll just say, okay? But if we're thinking about like an American environmentalism that really comes out of environmentalism in Europe and the United States primarily, but then has been kind of deployed in many places all over the world as well, right? This idea of nature that writers like Thoreau or like write about, right? It's this like pristine other place that like needs to be protected, you know, we are like a burden upon it, right? And I would say that that idea is taken as like a really innocent idea. Some, like when we read Thoreau, for example, I don't think that people are jumping like, oh my God, eco-fascism, right? But there are real similarities between that kind of perspective, that nature is this other pristine place that needs to be protected from like humans, and eco-fascism saying, yeah, facts, and we should also be really careful to protect it from certain kinds of humans, right? That's kind of the leap that's made in a way. And so it is like this slippery slope. And so, I mean, I guess to sum it up and make sure that we can get to questions, well, you can just go to the next slide so we stop saying harden. What I'm really thinking about is really the need to come together across, you know, diverse experience, like whatever that is, right? Whether that's like, you know, race, religion, class, sexuality, gender, like all those things, like actually coming together and listening to each other. And I think that in some ways that feels really hard right now. I mean, going down the street where I live, everybody's wearing masks and you can't even tell if somebody's smiling, and people don't want to say hi. They're like, stay away from me, you know, like I've like literally been walking through the park. I live next to this park, and there's like this lady like running, just like 6 feet social distancing, 6 feet. And it's like, oh my God, like so jarring. I'm so sorry that I wasn't far enough away from you. And, you know, like it doesn't promote the sense of like, yeah, let's get together. We're all in it and get together. It's pretty divisive. And so I would say that on this Earth Day, like really what I'm thinking about is the importance of us working together and not pointing the finger, not trying to blame like, oh, who like didn't wear their mask at the store today, or like, you know, that kind of stuff. It seems like it may seem like a stretch. It doesn't to me. Maybe I didn't articulate it well enough, but it may seem like a stretch to say that that's related to like our environmental politics. But I would say that that is definitely a part of our environmental politics. Like our response to the environment really needs to be about like visioning the world that we really want to live in. And for me, that's one where we all have rights. Our rights are all respected, right? And like we need to work together. So I'm just thinking about like really the importance of diversity right now, like diverse responses to this crisis, really listening right now. We're all going through a lot. This is a difficult time. And so I would just encourage you, like really listen to each other and try to see how the human problems that we're facing, or the social problems that we're facing, really do impact the kind of environmental problems that we're facing. And our response to them is equally really important for tackling the environmental crises that we're facing. So I'm just gonna end there because I feel like I could just keep talking about this, but I would really love to hear from you if you have any questions, and I'll open the chat in case I missed anything.
Just step in, Eli, just a second. Is it okay if I stop sharing the presentation?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great.
So, yes.
So in terms of facilitating this thing, if you want to put up questions on the chat stream, you can do that, or you can go to participants in your Zoom thing, and there's a raise hand feature, and you can use that, and we can facilitate this conversation. If there are points that you agree with, there are also reaction things, which are the equivalent of jazz hands that we can use here. So it's a way to kind of, you know, go back into our MUWCI style conversation. So let's make use of this platform. Thank you so much, Eli. It was really helpful. I also learned lots of new things. So you know, my applause hands.
Thanks, Anmol.
Duke.
Okay, so I just want to ask a question. So I still remember at the beginning of my very ESS journey, you gave us like a thick reading of Bill McKibben, The End of Nature.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, how is eco-fascism like different from his conception of like nature being something very pristine, and like, is there a good side to seeing us as like causing like some, you know, very big damage to nature?
Well, great question, Duke. Thank you. So I would say that Bill McKibben's argument in The End of Nature, for people who aren't familiar with it, is kind of this idea that our impact on our environment at this point is so great, basically, like we impact kind of every environment, right, on the planet, that we can't really maintain this idea that there ever was, you know, that there is nature. Like maybe nature did exist. I think Bill McKibben kind of does accept that nature did exist, but it doesn't anymore, or it's no longer useful to us to see it that way because it's an artificial kind of fake nature, like the ones that we can point to, which might be like national parks, for example. He's saying actually those even also are impacted, especially in times of climate change, right? Because I mean, climate change, we've affected the Earth's kind of climate systems, which is like the ultimate way to impact every environment on the Earth. And so his argument is really that, you know, for that reason, it's no longer useful to us. I would take it further and I would go with Vogel, and that's why we read Thinking Like a Mall as well. Do you remember that? Yeah. I mean, because I think that takes it a little bit further in saying, you know, no more than there not being nature anymore, or that the idea that maybe that could be interpreted from Bill McKibben's text, like we've put an end to nature in a way which kind of supports our argument, like, okay, we are the virus, like we've done it, right? I think Vogel is saying that term was like never of any use to us, right? To see us that way, we have always been intimately connected, and what makes us really so different from any other species that we would kind of, you know, make a whole set of terminology to divide us from kind of other species that we have interactions with, that it's not just that we impact the environment also impacts us, right? And so I don't know if that kind of helps to answer your question, but I would say that, you know, for sure we impact our environment, but we can't just see it as humans impact the environment. Like we also impact each other, like they're entanglements, like we're interconnected. I would say that's a less like a less eco-fascist way to see our relation to each other and other species, and to kind of come to terms with the kind of responsibilities we might have, not just to like the environment, which is becoming kind of a replacement for nature in some ways, but really the environment, like our lived environment, our cities, our things, our cars, like what is our responsibility to all the things and people we interact with, right? And a lot of cultures, and we've talked about this in ESS, there's no such thing as like a soulless object, right? Everything has soul. Like you make something, you build a building, you build a chair, you whittle away a spoon, or, you know, like those are things that have soul in them, right? They're made of matter, of carbon, of previously decayed matter, and we invest ourselves in them. So I think we need to rethink our responsibilities and our entanglements. And, you know, I definitely agree with that nature, there is no nature, we should do away with that. But I also believe it was really never of any use to us, I guess.
Thank you. Deepakshi?
So when you talked about how ecofascism is rising in terms of like just environmental activism, I really thought of like the posts I keep seeing on social media as to how so many people have said, you know what, us staying home is perhaps the best thing because the environment is thriving. And I do think that there is a fundamental flaw in that. But what I'm thinking is, like, how do we carry out conversations with like that group of people? Because clearly in my perspective, there's a lot of people who have that belief, and I haven't interacted with them yet, but I feel as though me going and saying that, you know, there's this eco-fascism and tragedy of commons, there's a chance that it will be counted as you're just ignorant and you just care about your selfish needs. You don't see what the environment is for. I'm just wondering how the interaction would be.
Thank you. I think this is a really great question. And yeah, I definitely personally wouldn't go to somebody posting about how it's great that air quality has improved because people are staying home and be like, you know what, that sounds a bit eco-fascist to me. That would definitely, you know, unless that was a person who was very receptive to criticism, which I think few of us are, I think, yeah, that would ignite like a lot. that would be really uncomfortable and maybe more damaging than not. I would feel for that person on some level, like how scarring to be just like noticing how air quality is changing and be like accused of eco-fascism. Like, it's not easy to accept, right, the ways in which we can improve sometimes, especially with labels like rooted in neo-Nazism. But I would say that we can take forward the conversation and like, you know, it would be great to engage with people who are making, you know, who feel strongly enough about what they're seeing to make a post, like, and say, oh yeah, like, you know, what have you noticed about that? And try to, I don't know, I think the best way is just like ask more questions rather than tell people kind of what it sounds like or who they are, to kind of help them discover it for themselves. Because, I mean, what I kind of tried to make clear, I guess I could have spent a little more time on, is I'm not really bringing up eco-fascism to be like, there's this group of people out there who are like doing this and it's dangerous, but to rather be like, in what ways is our response to this to kind of carrying these certain, you know, tones or parallels to that kind of ideology. Like, it's about noticing it within yourself. At least for me, this is like a process of really reflection. And I think that more than distancing ourselves from these kind of ideologies, which might seem extremist, trying to notice the ways in which they actually permeate like mainstream thought, okay? And that in kind of acknowledging that, we can then do something about it. I actually think it's more dangerous. Actually, the biggest danger of these kind of ideologies is creating these stark kind of divisions and not dealing with it, right? And saying, oh, that's these other kind of people. As long as I don't make those kind of posts or say those kind of really extreme things, I'm doing good, right? And I wouldn't say that's the case. I would say then it might be kind of this silent thing you're carrying inside, right? Like, talk about it, take risks, don't be afraid to say something that you'll regret saying. Like, just because we live in this digital age where everything is documented, like, don't be afraid of that. You're gonna grow. Like, we are all growing, we're all learning. It's a great thing, I would say, to be able to look back on something you said, whether it's on social media or not, and say, wow, I was really ignorant. I wouldn't say that today. Like, that means you've made progress, and that's a really good thing. So I hope that kind of answers your question. Like, I would not encourage you to call people up, but do ask questions, do dig deeper. How are we seeing the environment? How are we seeing the intersection of COVID and the environment? Definitely ask each other questions and have the conversation, but be respectful, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Dipakshi. Charlotte.
I was trying to undo my raising hand, so I will let the student ask questions instead, but I couldn't figure that out.
Okay, I've done it. No problem. Anyone else would like to ask a question? Eli, till then I have a question, right? Like, which is, so I actually really resonate with the idea that you're saying. Many years ago, I read a book called Ecology Without Nature, which is by an English lit professor who has become an ecologist, Timothy Morton. And they are part of a group of people who call themselves the dark ecologists. And they believe that this idea of nature is a medieval myth that has done more harm than good. And I particularly found two things that I resonated with, which is one, that when you actually create this nature non-nature divide, you actually in some ways encourage consumption, because the tree has to be respected, but the chair has to be consumed. So the chair is profane and the tree is sacred. So you go to the park, you enjoy the tree, you say you are in awe of it, but the chair is some form of contaminated stepchild of a human tree interaction, and therefore can be done away with. So it justifies a certain kind of consumption. And the second thing that I thought that that it was curious, like I was curious about, you you use the word entanglement, and I think Timothy Morton, they also like one of the ideas that Timothy Morton and Graham Horton, his co-thinker, bring up is the idea of hyper objects, that we are used to thinking of small discrete objects, but
Yeah.
that's not what is there in the world. Like internet is a hyper object, it's everywhere and it's nowhere. You know, climate change is or global warming is a hyper object. So uh, can you speak a little bit more about this sense of like entanglement, between nature, this thing that we used to call nature, and us, and how do you envision us kind of grappling with this very different way of looking, that we are entangled in everything, that these neat boundaries don't really help us maybe? Yeah, can you speak to that and maybe clarify it a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, I think you know this, but that's a really big question. I mean, right? Like, I think that indigenous worldviews, some that I've been introduced to, really helped me here in a way to kind of to see my entanglements more a little bit. And I think when I spent for me and how I see this, I mean, I've read, Jason Moore, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but who's written like extensively about these entanglements, and he wrote like a book, Capitalism in the Web of Life, right? But more than that, I think when I spent time in New Mexico living with the Zapatistas, who are primarily an indigenous group in Chiapas, like I learned a lot from them when I was, they were trying to teach me Spanish, and for them also Spanish is a second language, and they would share with me kind of what the differences are between their, native like mother tongue and Spanish. And it was, a lot of it was like, it doesn't make sense because like we're talking about things as if they're things, like, but like we don't do that. Like that's not how we're used to speaking. Like there aren't things, right? There is just like someone and then someone else, and like this idea of like one like personhood, right, is invested in everything. Like there's not, yeah, it's impossible to really talk about in English, but the fact that like even we pick something up, like a mug of tea, I'll be like, oh yeah, I pick up my mug, like in at least this several indigenous languages that they speak in Chiapas, all of them have in common that they say like the mug and I, something like this. This is how they explain it to me. I don't speak an indigenous language, but like the mug and I come into like relation and like rise or something like that, right? Like the idea that both have some kind of like agency. And that's kind of how I see this world of entanglements, is like you like, just like our social systems or our political systems or our economic systems influence kind of how we think and how we live, right? Like like consumerism, for example, right, is a really strong one, like that we all feel, like this pressure to consume things, like this competition to get like the latest, nicest, hippest thing, right? Or like I'm wearing like this shirt right now, like Adidas, for example, right? It's like I'm just trying to reflect on my own entanglements, like I got this in a thrift store, and like I don't think I would have bought like this long sleeve like navy blue shirt if it didn't have like this Adidas logo and like this like Adidas thing down the side. Like I don't know, but because that's been like marketed to me, right, then I'm like choosing to, now that thing is like appealing, like I want it, like it says something when I'm out and like people see me in this shirt. Now I'm gonna feel really self-conscious wearing this shirt around you guys, but I mean, I guess I'm trying to articulate that like just as that influences us, like we are so entangled in our like physical environment as well, and anything that can permeate that deeply, I think, to like how you think and like what you desire. Like I mean, desire is huge. Like we don't even really understand like our own desires well. I think, I mean, me, like I have this tendency to like intellectualize like everything, but like desire, like what I feel is like not something I understand. Like I feel like it just happened. So to try to understand that, right, that like when you're in nature, it makes you like feel a certain way, right, in nature, right? And like, what is that place that you're like calling nature? Like who made it? Because it's like this park, Golden Gate Park, is not like that I live close to. It's not like nature. It's like the furthest thing from nature that you can still call nature, right? Like it's a total manufactured like landscape, just like your house. So I think, I don't know if I'm explaining this well at all, but that's kind of how I think about entanglements. I mean, you could think about it in a really literal way in which like, you know, like we're all connected or something like that. And that's true. But when I really try to reflect on my entanglements, that's what I'm thinking about, is like reflecting on like when I'm in this space, like how it makes me feel, and like, and what is that space, and like, why does it make me feel that way? Like, yeah, I guess that's as close as I can get.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Miranda.
I was very interested with this part where you said about how maybe like indigenous like cosmology and perception can aid us also like in understanding that like interconnection. But and I just wanted to like ask, is that I feel like a lot of the new like wave of environmental like activism is also like, because in the past maybe it was like criticized for not like for being like very westernized and centered on like ideas which were not applicable to other like contexts and communities. I feel like there's also like a tangent right now where people are deciding to like take the standard of like indigenous communities and say like, oh, this is what they're doing that is right. But I don't know if it's necessarily portraying it in the correct manner, where we're like actually advocating for the correct, like are we actually like being able to portray in the message what is valuable about them, or are we just like exoticizing this image? And I don't know like how can we like move forward as environmentalists to avoid that being exoticizing this image and just thinking of them like thinking like, oh, they're doing it right because they're living like in the jungle or things like that, instead of actually deriving what is the true essence that can be applicable to people that like will never be able to live like those communities, no, like that will live in cities which are overpopulated, and how can we like adapt those like both like realities, no?
You know, really great question. Thank you so much. I mean, yeah, I think there's so many thoughts that are like really coming at me right now, actually. But I would say that this is a real, like what you're raising right now, it is like a real issue that we're facing. I would say in some ways, it's a bit kind of, it's a distinct concern from the kind of way that I am pulling on indigenous knowledge, in the sense that the kind of like the kind of exploitation of like indigenous like culture, I mean, can be really and manifest in extreme like ways. But there are these more subtle ways that we try to take from indigenous cultures. I would say that in a way, a lot of indigenous cultures are right now struggling with how to change themselves, and like how to see change. Like all cultures change over time, right? But there's a real moment right now where the change is being like forced on indigenous societies so quickly, and a lot is being taken from them at the same time in the name of like sharing and intercultural exchange, right? When it's not really like an equal exchange, right? And so I definitely like, I've learned, I'll just speak for myself, because I'm not like really like an expert in this area at all, but I have learned a lot from indigenous cultures, specific ones, not like indigenous culture, right? But specific ones, specifically in the time that I've spent working with indigenous people in Guatemala and also in Mexico. I worked in Guatemala and I was a student when I was in Mexico, and less so in the United States, honestly. I have had much less interaction in my home country with indigenous folks. And I guess what I take from them is not so concrete in the way that some people are taking actual practices or actual like medicines and plants and things like that, and then taking it, you know, into a city, into a metropolitan place and capitalizing that. Or I can think of from Guatemalan people, for example, taking things like the huipil, which is like a traditional like way of dressing. I mean, it was introduced by colonizers, but now it's a symbol, right, of like indigenous like strength and yeah, like, and resistance to some extent to the like Ladinoization, I guess, of indigenous people, right? In Guatemala, anyways, like there's like the physical taking of that object and then putting it like on pillows as pillowcases and like selling it. That's like an extreme manifestation of that. But I agree that we do have to think about the more subtle ways in which we take from indigenous cultures, right, without having any like equal exchange. And I also think we need to think, how do we support, I mean, for me, this is like the big question I've been thinking about, is like, how do we support indigenous people, indigenous nations, indigenous societies, like in the kind of change that they're going to have to undergo, like as a result of what's happening in their environment in a large way, right? Like entire environments, like biomes are changing, okay? Like they're going to have to change how they live, and they're reckoning with that. Like, how do we support them in ways where we're not just benefiting from that relationship, right? Does that make sense? Like, I think that that's a real concern about going in, and cultural exchange is never like, or rarely a super like equal thing where like both sides are exchanging equally. Like that's an ideal that we try to like live to. But I think that that intercultural exchange is really important for like, can be really valuable for everybody involved. And I don't think that like modern society or modern people or settlers are like evil. That would be, I guess that would be like self-loathing in a way, but that's not why. Like on principle, like I think we all have a role to play and just need to step up to the responsibility. I think sometimes it's hard to imagine what that looks like when from indigenous societies, there's a very strong like commitment to like preservation, right? Which we've seen how valuable that is. And I'm not arguing against it in any way. But I think that within indigenous societies, there's you know, there's definitely a lot of like fear of what can be lost when you engage with settlers, which is so valid, right? And so I think that those are the kind of things we need to wrestle with. Like, I don't really have solutions because I haven't clearly thought through this enough or engaged enough and listened to enough indigenous people to really know. But I do think that we can learn a lot from them. I know on a personal level I have. And I think the kind of things that I've taken in terms of seeing that that the things around you have soul is the biggest thing for me that I've taken, probably, is something that I don't know, I think can be really a way that actually that we can give back. Does that make sense? Like, I think that taking that lesson and seeing the world in that way actually helps me to be more responsible about kind of how I consume and how I participate in my environment, and not being so kind of destructive and just seeing these as things that we can just, oh, we can just make a new one or something like that, which is what I was raised on. But it's actually transformed really how I think and how I feel when I interact with my environment. And I think that's a positive thing for the world. At least that's how I'm seeing it right now. Yeah, but thank you. It's a really great question. And I'd love to like talk about that more. I'm just feeling that there's so much more I could learn about that right now. So thanks.
Thank you, Miranda.